right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to one of the first afternoon sessions here. The session that's going to happen right now is from Siva Appiah at ISC, or Indigenous Services Canada, Ontario region. He's been with the department for more than 15 years and has been with the Government of Canada for approximately 25 years. I'll let him give you a little bit, talk a little bit more about himself, if he likes. And I know he's currently responsible providing guidance on the delivery of implementation of on-reserve housing programs in Ontario, including working with First Nations and tribal councils. Hey, thank you, Siva.
Thank you, Severio. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Siva Appiah. I'm the Senior Housing Officer with Indigenous Services Canada, and I have a whole team here from Indigenous Services Canada that I work with, and we'll be here throughout the session. If you have any questions, and if you don't get to ask during the session, just feel free to approach me. So maybe I'll just get right in, and if we get more time at the end, we can chat a little bit more about what we do in the housing team. I do have another session, though, on Thursday, where we'll be talking about more related to the targeted programming. Today is all about what we do on a normal basis, how we support First Nations for housing on reserve. Okay, so there's a number of ways that we support housing on reserve for First Nation people. We don't do any programming off reserve. All the programming that I'm going to talk about today is for on reserve housing projects. The first one is the Capital Facilities and Management Program, normally also known as minor capital funding. I'll get into that a little bit detail. We have a slide to further, with some further details. The other program is the Ministerial Loan Guarantee Program. Sandra Liu is here, and we have a new employee taking over some of that caseload, Abdul. We'll talk a little bit more later. Targeted funding, I'll briefly touch on targeted funding, but we have a whole presentation on Thursday, so we'll get into a lot deeper on the targeted funding programs. And then we also have a shelter allowance program through the Ontario Works, and we also support housing through the emergency management program. So let's take a look at the minor capital funding. So this is the long-term sustainable funding provided to every First Nation at the beginning of the year. So the First Nation Chief and Council is to prioritize their projects for this funding. We provide the funding at the beginning of the year, and then we ask the community to prepare a plan for that funding and send it to us. So every year, through the First Nations Infrastructure Investment Plan, the community will report back to us as to how they are going to spend that money, and then following year, they'll send us a report just confirming what's been done with that funding. Again, it happens annually. It's provided to communities in their first agreement, in the initial agreement, and there is no application process for that. Approximately in the region, we spend $23 to $24 million on this stream of funding, and communities will get to decide how they spend that funding. So for an example, in terms of allocation, a community with 1,200 members living on reserve is, would be getting around $400,000 annually. It is indexed for the zoning. So Zone 4 community with the 1,200 members living on reserve would annually get about $400,000. Another example to look at is a smaller community, 405 members living in the same Zone 4 would get about $162,000. So this is, again, I said the community will decide how they're going to spend that funding. And the guiding principle is to give First Nation greater control over their programming. And the other goal is to build capacity in communities so that they can plan, manage, provide housing for their members on an ongoing basis. It also recognizes the shared responsibility, and communities, again, are given the option to introduce shelter charges, ownership options, anything else that they want to introduce in their community when it comes to housing. There are, you will hear rent-to-own options, social housing options, home ownerships, revolving loan funds. Those are some of the strategies communities have used in the past and still using it. And it also allows communities to do debt financing with this money. So you can actually take this money, use it as a down payment on a mortgage, or use it to provide subsidies towards building home ownership in communities. You can use it to pay back mortgages that you borrowed money from commercial banks. So that is also an allowable expense with this funding. So really what I really take away from this presentation, or from this capital facilities and maintenance program, is participants should have a better understanding of the program objectives, long-term goals, and be better prepared for managing their own housing objectives through this for service transfer. So I think many of you may have heard Indigenous Services Canada and Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation is working with AFN and other community organizations in transferring the responsibility to the First Nations to manage their own housing programs. This is a predictable funding, so you have a better understanding or better assurance or commitment that this funding will come to the community. It may vary slightly based on the population, but usually it doesn't, the change is not significant enough that it will make a huge impact over year. So the next one is the Ministerial Loan Guarantee Program. As I mentioned earlier, Sandra Liu and Abdul are primarily responsible for delivering it. I look after it as a senior officer, and we also have Karim, who's our manager for the unit. As many of you know, Indian Act prevents the use of reserve land as a security and prevents seizure from a lender. So in most cases, in the off-reserve situation, when you go get a mortgage and you default on a mortgage, the bank basically will take the house eventually. That option is not available for commercial lenders when the project is on reserve. Because of that, they are it's difficult to get financing on reserve for mortgages. In order to overcome that barrier, the minister provides a guarantee, it's a 100% guarantee to the lender so that they are more comfortable with doing business with the First Nations for housing. The guarantee allows the lender to claim any outstanding principal and the interest, including some administrative charges, if the loan goes into a default. So it is not necessarily a funding program, it's a guarantee program. The community is going to manage the project on their own, and we simply deal with the lender to do the guarantee. The application still comes from the community, and we do an assessment to determine the risk level for the department, and we work with the community up until to the point where we are ready to sign an agreement with the lender. Once an agreement is signed with the lender has direct access to pay out from the department if the loan is to go into a default. Just to give you an idea of how well this program is used, as of October 14th, 2023, we have 700 active guarantee agreements with commercial lenders. Those 700 agreements cover 4,558 homes in Ontario region. As of that date, we have $327 million in outstanding loan amount. So we have 127 First Nations in Ontario. about 105 of the First Nations use that program or have used that program in the past. So we still have around 22 communities not involved in the ministerial loan guarantee program. That also is an indication that those 22 communities are not involved in the CMHC programming. So all of Section 95 program from by CMHC require a ministerial loan guarantee, and so that, if your community is not involved in the Section 95 program or not involved in the ministerial loan guarantee, that's something I would encourage you to take a look into it. We can work with CMHC and the community to see how that could be a venue for building more homes or renovating more homes on reserve. Again, this was intended to give you a basic understanding of the program objectives and how this may be an applicable option for communities to increase their housing stock in their communities. Again, it's as an option. If the community decides to access, we are more than willing to work with the community. Even if your community is not in a great financial position, we do look at housing as a essential service that the chief and council is required to offer to their members. And sometimes, we work with the community as long as the community is willing to work with us to overcome some of the risk involved in borrowing. We don't really turn anybody away. One of the very, one of the reasons why many communities are still in draft stage for their application is their audit. So we don't have discretion over audit. If your audit is overdue from previous years, I'm talking the comprehensive community audit, then your ministerial loan guarantee is held back. Because without the audit, we cannot do an assessment of the community's financial capacity to borrow. So if you have overdue audits, I really encourage you to work with your auditor. We can also work with the auditor to provide whatever it is that they need in order to complete the audit, so you have access to ministerial loan guarantee program, which also allows you to access any of the CMHC Section 95 program, which is a social housing program. From my experience, if you are successful in Section 95 program, you're guaranteed 4 to 5 units a year, which is, you can't claim it back in the next year. So if you lose it, you lose it. So it really makes a huge impact when it comes to social housing. Also for Section 10, we call it, if you have home ownership or if you want to introduce home ownership on reserve and the member is willing and able to build their own home, they can get a mortgage and we can do a guarantee for them as well. So there is 2 options. One is for social housing. The other one is for home ownership, for individual to borrow and build their dream home as they wish. So targeted programming. I'm not going to get into too much detail. As I said, we'll be doing a whole presentation on it. We have a number of initiatives right now in the works. But this is just to give you a high-level overview of how the targeted programming works. These are special allocations, allocations of funds by the Parliament, depending on the government of the day. You will see announcements in the budget speech about how much money they are spending or allocating to First Nations housing, and that's where it starts. It starts from the budget speech, and then it goes into the process in order for us to get the money into the hands of the First Nations. Generally, these are predetermined specific activities, like contrary to the minor capital I mentioned earlier. These ones are more focused on achieving very specific targets in communities. We do have to report on those targets, and we do ask reporting from communities very specific to that funding. There's also a time restriction. There is a start date and an end date. Communities are required to complete those projects within that timeline. However, the timeline has been more flexible now than in the past. We have multi-year funding and multi-year commitments, so we are able to work with communities over 2-3 years to complete their projects, as opposed to in the past that you'll be given April to March deadline. So in terms of the process, so you will have, again, this is for very high-level information purposes only. So you'll have the federal budget announcement. You will hear, it's a public knowledge. If you want to get a copy of it, you can go online and get a copy of it. After the budget is announced, then the department has to submit has to do a Treasury Board submission in order to access that funding. Even though the money is announced for the public, we don't have access to that money until we tell Treasury Board how exactly we are going to spend that money, what are some of the outcomes that we are going to achieve, and what will be the terms and conditions of that funding, so Treasury Board can release that funding to us. So once Treasury Board is satisfied with the intent of the funding and the outcome and the deliverables, they will give us the budget line. Once that budget line is given to us, then we are able to sign a funding agreement with the communities. Usually we'll do a call for proposal or expression of interest in order to find out, who needs what and what they want to build in their communities or renovate in their communities. Based on those expressions of interest or application, we'll do funding approvals, and then we'll get into doing a funding agreement with the community. After the funding agreement is signed, the community is responsible for project implementation. We do high-level monitoring of the project, but it is entirely the community doing the planning, design, contracting, inspections from beginning to the end. They work with tribal councils for inspections and planning purposes, but at the end of so throughout the project, we will ask for reporting at milestone achievements. However, the community is completely responsible for implementation. At the end of that implementation, we will ask for reporting. So that reporting helps us in order to report back to Treasury Board on our outcomes and goals that we included in the Treasury Board submission. And then the cycle starts again. And then you have the budget speech the following year, and we start the cycle over again. So in terms of targeted funding, I just picked the last two popular ones that we have dealt with. The budget 2021 was a 3-year commitment. As I mentioned earlier, the government has improved in their approaches. It's no longer a 1-year commitment, 2-year commitment. It's, in the past, it's been multi-year commitments. It gives us, more time to plan and implement projects with the communities, and also give the communities more time to plan and implement projects in their own communities. So we had the budget 2021 announcement, which was a 3-year commitment starting in 2021, 2022, and it is sunsetting this year. So this year is the last year for that announcement, which was a 3-year commitment. First year, we received about $32 million. Second year, about the same. Third year, about the same. And we did spend all that money. So we did not slip any money. If we do slip any money, we do have to send it back to Ottawa, and it gets reallocated or goes back into the general revenue fund. So we don't like to do that. We did work, and thanks to the tribal councils and the First Nations in Ontario, we were able to get good projects going, and we did spend all that money in Ontario. Then came the budget 2022 announcement, which is a little bit more improvement than the budget 2021. It is a 5-year commitment and $2.4 billion over 5 years. So what did that mean for Ontario? We received $36 million in year 1 of a national budget of $143 million. In year 2, we received $41 million over a national budget of $238 million. In year 3, which is next year, we are expecting to get 89.7 million over a 476 million nationally. And in year 4, 101 million out of 590 million nationally, and year 5, 114 million over a national budget of 668 million. As you can see, the budget 2022 is an escalating budget. It starts off small, and it is almost doubles as the years go by. This is where I wanted to give a heads up to the communities where you really have to get your shovel readiness up to par in order to access those funds. And if you're behind on your lot servicing or renovations, or if you don't have your plans ready, if you don't have your project schedules ready, if you don't have enough contractors, this is just a heads up that we do have funding over the next 3 years at least. For the next 3 years, who knows, there might be more announcements in the budget, but this budget is at least confirmed for the next 3 years, and communities have access to it, and we will be spending all that money. So, if you don't have the capacity, we can work with you and the tribal councils to build that capacity so that you have access to these funds. Again, the purpose of me talking about it today is just to give you an idea of what the budget is coming down to us and to improve the shovel readiness within a short period of time. Again, usually when we announce these initiatives, communities are just running around trying to find the lots to build, trying to find stamp drawings, trying to find a contractor that's willing to come in and come in and build. And oftentimes they miss the deadline or they're behind on their project. And we've seen that all, and we still have that challenge with the existing projects. So just to improve that shovel readiness, we want to work with you. We want to work with you to better access those funds. Because, if you fail, we fail. If we don't spend the funds, we have to send it back to Ottawa. There's nothing else that we can do with that money. Complete the planning activities ahead of time as much as possible. So last year, we made some additional funding available to tribal councils. I believe we offered up to $100,000 for every tribal council last year in order to assist with that planning and project management, and also to catch up with projects from the past years. This year, we are offering additional funds to the communities directly. So I will talk about it later at the next event, next session. Contractors, plans, scope of work, site ready, all of that, you know what to do. But again, talking about maybe, if there's not enough contractors, you want to have your own crew building it. I know there's a number of communities doing that. There's a number of training programs out there. If you have people in your community ready, willing, and able, and want to get into construction industry, that's something that we can work with as well in order to build that capacity and create the workforce within the communities. Right now, we are working with at least 2 communities. One is partnering with an 8-week construction program. So those trainees, I believe there are just over 20 people going through that training. At the end of the training, they will be building 4 tiny homes in their communities as part of their training. And after that, the crew is on their own building homes in their community. So there's innovative approaches out there. Communities are using it. We come to know it because we work with all communities in Ontario. Whatever your challenge is, just talk to us. We can point you to the communities that are working with these programs already. That may be a lead for you to start your own. There's been a lot of emphasis on long-term planning, proactive approaches to addressing housing. And I know we hear from communities all the time that there's housing crisis and people don't have house, homelessness is growing. But even if we do have the funding, it takes time to plan and build homes, and there is really no easy solution. So anything that we can do to move towards longer-term planning, more proactive approaches we are interested in. We've been audited just recently. There'll be an Auditor General report coming out, and I've seen a draft report. Some of these things that I'm talking about is what they are identifying in the reports. Communities have to start preparing themselves for longer-term planning and addressing, like foreseeing that problem in advance and prevent that crisis in communities. Okay, shelter allowance. So we have an agreement with the Ontario, province of Ontario, since 1965. It's called 1965 Indian Welfare Agreement. It is delivered through the province of Ontario, and we cost share 92%, I believe, with the province. What this is for people living on reserve, this agreement allows the same benefit as those people who are living off reserve when they're low income. So this is unique to Ontario. We call it provincial comparability. First Nations in Ontario can access Ontario Works like anybody else in the province of Ontario through their Ontario Works administrator and the disability support programs the same way. And within that benefit, we allow shelter cost. So if you have a rental regime in your community and community members are not able to pay rent, they can apply to the Ontario Works, and Ontario Works will cover up to the maximum of what is eligible under the shelter cost. That benefit is intended to pay for their shelter. If you have difficulty collecting rent from the members receiving Ontario Works, you can also, as a landlord, you can also negotiate an agreement with the Ontario Works administrator so that shelter component of the benefit can go directly to the landlord, which in this case would be the First Nation administration. We don't like to recommend that because we think people should be managing their own affairs, own budget. However, if it comes to a point where you either evict the tenant or get your rent paid, we do recommend that you work with Ontario Works administrator to cover the rental component or shelter component of the benefit to be redirected to the band until you have an agreement or you've reached an agreement with the tenant that they will pay their own. So based on the most recent data we have, because this is not a benefit delivered directly from Indigenous Services Canada to the individuals, it goes through the province. We do have a lapse in getting the data. So the most recent data we have is from 2021-2022. Based on that data, we spend about $38 million annually on that shelter component alone for Ontario recipients. So as you can see, it's quite a chunk of money. It's more than your minor capital. So if you don't have a rental regime, if you don't have your members accessing these funds through Ontario Works, I really encourage you to work with the Ontario Works administrator and access those funds into your housing budget. So takeaway, just to give you the basic understanding of how we cover shelter cost for low-income members living on reserve, and you have the ability to implement rental policies for low-income people because there is a revenue stream even for low-income families. And you also have the ability to negotiate direct payments with Ontario Works should there be an issue with implementing rental regimes for Ontario Works recipients. I think this is our last slide, and I'll take questions. Housing support through emergency management. Emergency Management Assistance Program provide funding for First Nation communities so they can build resiliency, prepare for natural hazards, and respond to them under the 4 pillars of the emergency management. So we do have an emergency management program where if there is an unforeseen natural disaster happen, flood, tornadoes, whatever it happens to be, we do respond, and we do respond through the emergency management program. They cover a range of expenses, one of which is housing. So if a house is damaged or destroyed by a natural disaster, flooding, tornadoes, earthquakes, anything like that, we help the individual to rebuild that home or rebuild better in a different location. If the location is prone to flooding, there's no point building it on the same location. They can rebuild better in another location. It is a limited funding. It is based on the events that happen. We work with our national headquarters to access the funding when and if the event happens. However, even if it's a small event of strong wind, damaging your roofs, they do cover the replacement of homes or repairs to the homes damaged by natural disasters. So just another option for keeping your housing stock in good conditions. So hopefully you have some knowledge of the emergency management program. It is a very complex program, but all I wanted to highlight is that there is help available to rebuild homes and repair homes if they are damaged by any kind of natural disaster. If that does happen, you can contact our emergency management coordinator, or you contact one of us. We'll redirect you to the right person in order to access that help. So I have a team of people that I work with. Just briefly, Tracy Roblin, Kate, Kathy came back after retirement for a short-term assignment, Sandra Liu, Jonathan, Karim, who's our manager, and Abdul is the most recent addition to our team. I'll stop there and see if there's any questions. We do have quite a bit of time. Yeah?
So that the last slide there on the emergency management program, so with the increase in forest fires, supposing someone had, they paid for their own house, it's a private house, but it's on reserve, and it got destroyed by a disaster like this, would they be eligible to apply to this program?
Yeah, forest fire is one of the eligible natural disasters that the program recognizes. Even individuals can access it, yes. But they will work with the chief and council, though. They don't work with us directly. Everything that we do is through the chief and council, but it is eligible, yeah.
And it's a national program too, right?
It is a national program, yeah. David? I would say just talk to the emergency management coordinator. It might be a little difficult because you have to prove that it is because of the natural disaster that happened. And usually, the replacement is right after the disaster happens to move people back into their homes. If the home stayed unoccupied or if the disaster happened a while ago, it might be a little difficult. I would say if an event is to happen, to approach our emergency management folks right away, not wait for too long. Because then they have to go back to the date and when the event happened and what the damages were and so on. They have to somehow link it to an event that happened.
So how closely tied are you to working with closing the infrastructure gap that was identified through the Assembly First Nations last year with the
So closing the infrastructure gap is not a funding program yet. It was an exercise to find out what the demand is out there. I'm not the expert on it, so I'm not the one to talk to, but under the Capital Facilities and Management Program, infrastructure is an eligible cost. We do infrastructure like through our regular programming. Closing the infrastructure gap gave us an estimate of what is needed out there based on what the First Nations think that they need. From what I know, it's been rolled up and provided to central agencies and government, and the hope is that we will get additional monies, but there hasn't been anything that's announced as a result of that exercise. But it is in the works. We haven't seen any funding announcements out of that exercise. Karim coordinated the event in the exercise in Ontario. I don't know, Karim, do you have anything to add?
Hey there. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So just to answer that question, we don't have an answer yet. At that particular point in time, the point of the whole closing the infrastructure gap exercise was to gauge how much is the need out there. And from that point forward, it was explained to us from the submissions that each and every single First Nation provided. Actually, we had about 93 First Nations. So about 75% of the communities provided that information into us. And just with that information alone, it was a $12 billion ask across just Ontario region. AFN also took a look at the numbers, and they actually increased that number from 12 to actually 44 billion. As you know, we don't have 44 billion. It's not realistic, right? So in that time, this past year, what we did was what's called the infrastructure modernization, which was a conversation as to how can we actually achieve this. And part of the idea was, is there a way that we can get financing? First Nations can get financing from third-party lenders, from First Nations banks, or just different ways of doing, addressing that issue. Right now, we've taken the information provided from communities, not only from closing the infrastructure gap, but also from the infrastructure modernization engagement sessions we did. And we've passed that information on to our headquarters, who are then now putting a memorandum to cabinet and actually submitting that, I think, in January of 24. So we're hopeful that if there's funding or if there's ways of actually addressing that issue, we just don't have any information yet, but it's still in the works. So it is being talked about at this point in time.
Thanks, Karim. So I talked about the process to get targeted funding, and I started from announcement in the federal budget. So what we talked about here related to closing the infrastructure gap is to get onto that budget. So we collected and put on all the rationales that we can and submitted to the central agencies so that it can make it to the federal budget announcement. But when it make it, you'll know before us. We'll all find out at the same time. However, if you have severe infrastructure gap that you can no longer build homes in the communities, we do encourage you to put that into your First Nations infrastructure investment plan. That gives us a flag as to which community needs what, and then our capital management officers will work with those communities to get some projects going, at least in the interim, so that we can continue to build homes and infrastructure in the communities. There was somebody else in that, okay. That table there, and then Alice. I don't know how to answer that question. I know a number of factors goes in there. It's predetermined, so we don't identify it. If you look at the band classification manual, if you just search up in Google band classification manual, it goes through all the factors that they consider in determining the zones. The zones haven't been updated recently, so it is still using like quite an old manual. Some communities may have since built roads, so it's no longer zone 4. It might be zone 3 because now they built a road, but it's not reflected in the band classification manual. But if you want to know more about it, just take a look at that manual. They look at the closest service center, they look at your road access, they look at if you have an airport, if it's a remote community, if you have an airport, a number of factors goes in there to determine what zone. But for us, it's predetermined. If you call us and say, what zone is my community, we can tell you what that is.
Sorry, that's called band classification manual?
Yeah. Like Indian band classification manual.
And then, my question was, square foot prices per home. How do you develop that number? Is that researched? Is that based on geography?
Yeah, so we have a base price, and then we index it to the zones. So every dollar in zone 1 would be, I don't know, $1.65 in zone 4. So we index them to the zone based on the base pricing. Okay?
Then you add 30%.
Only for Jonathan. Because we don't want to get that phone call from Jonathan. Sorry, Alice, you have a question? Go ahead, Alice. Oh, sorry, it's not Alice, it's somebody else. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I have several questions because you went over a lot of material, so I hope you can bear with me. In regards to the on-reserve funding, you said might not help have that drastic of an effect in regards to on-reserve housing. Recently, ISC and CMHC just joined forces to create a national collaborative housing initiatives to address the urban and rural and northern housing. 300 million was giving out to, well, 281.5 million was given out to that organization with very little consideration of the First Nations and their housing dilemmas. As most of our First Nations, their populations live off reserve, you would have thought that they would have gone and collaborated with some of the First Nations of how that funding could roll out so that our First Nations could actually deal with their community members both on and off reserve in regards to the whole housing initiative. That's my first thing, because the next thing that's falling out under that, the short term was 281.5 million. The long term is 4 billion. I'm just saying that there wasn't any consideration given, and I think everybody here in the room that works and deals with First Nation community knows that our community members are also off reserve. That's just a sight, and I would hope that ISC and CMHC could come together to maybe review what that decision was and how it was based on the whole centralization of that initiative, because it might help our housing on our First Nations if that funding was directed back to the people who already have established housing initiatives and great work that's going on within their communities and for their people. And already the off-reserve Indigenous housing forums that are there now that are being ignored as well. The second one is the capping of the population that you had on there. 1,200 was the cap. I thought capping for communities had stopped. So there's only $400,000 that was allowed for that one slide you had on there, because the population was capped at 1,200 members. So basically, are you saying that that cap still exists? Okay, so it doesn't exist anymore, so that a larger First Nation then gets more. Oh, okay, so that was just reconfirming that, because my understanding of there's some of our larger First Nations that I work with, they receive less than that. But okay, I'll go back to my chiefs and make sure they have their information correct. In regards to the audit and why some of our First Nations ministerial guarantees are waylaid, I would ask that the audit, and we have done letters to ask that the audit days that they're allowed to submit, instead of being 120, that it maybe be up to maybe 160 days, because sometimes auditors don't always get out to the First Nations communities, or they put First Nations at the back burner, or they're last on their list to do their audits. And some audits are quite large as well and complicated because of the variety of programs. So if you can take that back, I would appreciate that, to maybe up the days for that, and then that might get the ministerial guarantees processed a lot faster as well. And then with regard to the shelter allowance, you said that there was 38 million Ontario Works. I can tell you right now that the reason that there's so many homelessness out there, because we also work with the homelessness, is because the shelter allowance hasn't grown. It doesn't meet the ability for them to pay, so they have to take the allowance that they're given every month to go towards shelter allowance. A lot of these people are now getting the shelter allowance under their OW. In order to sacrifice that they have a shelter, they're going to food banks now. That has to increase. I know you're saying that 38 million is a lot. It's not. I'm telling you that right now. It's not in regards to the whole issue that's going on right there. So something has to be done to increase the amount that's given to Ontario Works and the ODS people out there. It's not enough to address the shelter allowance. I mean, the 200, I think it's 260, that's for a single person under OW for shelter allowance. I don't know about you, but I don't know any place where I could live for a month for $260 a month, or any place you can pay that kind of rent. I mean, if you guys know of a place, let me know, because I'd like to move in. Other than that, like I said, not really questions, but I'm hoping you can take this back and maybe change something, or help that some of these things along the lines will get changed. I'd appreciate it.
Thank you, and I think a lot of it is good information we'll take back. I don't know if I can answer all the questions, but I can offer some comments just for clarity. All the programming that we do is only for on-reserve. We don't have mandate to do off-reserve housing, but we have another section of our department that deal with off-reserve. So all of the investments that I talked about here is for on-reserve only. And in terms of the sizing, this is just an example of how, what the funding would look like for a community of 1,200 members or for a community of 405 members. But there is no cap. It is, the size of the community falls into the calculation. The initiative that you talked about, I'm not too familiar with. It might be a national initiative outside of, falls under the National Housing Investment. It's not something that we are working with. I'm not too sure. But in terms of collaborating with CMHC, we do. We have an ongoing close relationship with CMHC. Somebody is always talking to us. I know we are talking to them on a daily basis. We try to do as much as possible. 2 years ago, we funded everybody who couldn't be funded by CMHC for whatever reasons. So we covered those communities. Last year, we provided all of our, the list of all of renovation projects to CMHC, and CMHC was able to top up an additional $15,000 for every housing unit that we funded. So there's been some ongoing projects and partnerships with CMHC, and like I said, it's only going to grow. We both have the same mandate to do programming on reserve, and we do as much as possible. We do also collaborate on capacity building. We've done projects for capacity building training with both our funds. We've done projects where, CMHC will cover the training, we'll cover the construction, but, the community has to put that pieces together and come to us, and we'll try and make it work as much as possible. We meet with CMHC at least annually on a formal meeting, but informally, we talk to them on a daily basis. Yeah.
You guys do elders' homes up north. Is there money in that? The numbers you're
Yeah, elders' home, seniors' homes, whatever you want to call it, as long as it's an independent living, we cover the cost. It's as part of the housing for the community. So the community decides whether they want to build homes for the single people, for the families, for elders, or a combination of all of them. It's at the discretion of the community. We don't decide what type of homes, but we give the funds to the community, and then they do the design and build. We do not cover long-term care facilities, but we do cover independent living. Right?
Just a question, and you partially answered it, but I want to ask it anyways. So ISC serves First Nations with funding opportunities. So there's a lot of reasons why First Nation members are living out of community, whether their community was displaced by the government in the past, or for opportunity, or for a variety of reasons. Why is there no funding for ISC for First Nation funding off reserve? Why is the mandate only on reserve? Is that too limited a scope given the number of First Nation people living out of community?
It's not that there's no funding available for off-reserve, it's not delivered through Indigenous Services Canada. We have a different department, CERNAC. They deal with off-reserve, Métis, and Inuit housing, and they have a different strategy. So if you look in the National Housing Strategy, there's a separate strategy for Métis, Inuit, and off-reserve compared to on-reserve First Nations living on reserve.
Okay, so talk to CERNAC then.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, and don't ask me to spell it out. Crown Indigenous Relations, CIRNAC.
Hi, I just have a quick question. Just going back to your budget, the 5-year plan, are you guys expecting allocations to increase proportionately to the budget increases, or is that based on our FNHC? Like, how do you plan on those allocation increases happening with basically doubling of the 5-year budget? Just kind of for future planning, and because I'm curious.
So in terms of the funding availability for the region, that's what we have. On top of that, we have an additional about $23 million. In the next session, on Thursday, I'll be talking more about the initiatives that we introduced out there to spend that money.
Perfect. So when we get an EOI and there's a certain amount allocated to our First Nation, should we expect the allocation to increase proportionately to that budget?
We don't know yet.
Okay.
So right now,
I
we
will
did the
wait.
expression of interest last year. So any communities who have not accessed through that initiative will be a priority. And then once that is done, we just recently announced a few additional initiatives. So some of that funding will go towards that, and the funding guidelines will come along with that. So yeah, it'll be based on what the guidelines say at that time. But generally, we try to increase it at least to cover the inflation every year.
Can we do one more question, Siva?
Sure?
Just one last one, because we got to cut it off.
Just a question. A lot of all these projects are requiring shovel readiness and whatnot. Is there any grants or anything or other funding streams available for the communities to help offset some of these front-end costs that they have to incur? I know that's often a huge hurdle to overcome to meet the level of shovel readiness that you guys are looking for as part of these submissions.
I'm glad you asked that question. That's something that we're going to be talking about at the next session as well, but I'll briefly touch on it. So this year, or last year, we introduced lot servicing and pre-construction activities as one of the categories that we can fund. So if communities are not shovel ready in the first year, they can access that pre-construction activities stream and be ready for the following year for construction.